On August 15, 2010, 49-year-old Diane Kain was found dead in her bed, in her bedroom. Her son, Kevin, panicked and called emergency services, shouting to the operator that his stepfather had killed his mother. A few minutes later, another call came into 911 from the same location. This time, it was Bill Kain, Diane's husband, who, struggling to breathe, told the operator that his stepson had strangled his wife. Only 3 people were in the house, and one of them was dead. Only 2 knew the truth. What happened to Diane Kain that day? Was she murdered by the man she considered the love of her life, or was it her own flesh and blood who took her life? The calls were even more unusual because they were made in the midst of a heated argument. One person called and told the truth, while the second had already concocted the story that would allow them to walk away unscathed. It's inconceivable how cunning the mind of this killer must be. The city of Seminole is located in Pinellas County, Florida. This is where Bill Kain lived with his wife Diane and her 23-year-old son, Kevin. Bill described Diane as the woman of his dreams. They met in the early 2000s when Bill noticed a very beautiful woman outside a nail salon she ran with her twin sister. They exchanged a few words, and Diane went about her business, but the beautiful woman lingered in Bill's mind. He had to find a way to get to know her. Bill persuaded his daughter to get a manicure at the salon. With his daughter's encouragement to visit the salon, he gathered the courage to ask Diane out. It was a passionate romance, and less than 2 years later, they were married. Bill's 5 children were happy that their father had found new love. Diane's son, Kevin, also initially formed a strong bond with Bill. After 4 years of living with his stepfather, he decided to take on the family's last name. The family seemed very happy, but not everything was going well. Kevin had always been the center of his mother's attention, and now he had to move into a house with 5 other children and share their collective memories, making him feel like an outsider. Kevin's cousin recalls that it wasn't easy for him because the other kids didn't accept him and treated him poorly. However, by 2010, Bill's 5 children had already moved out and started their own lives. Only 23-year-old Kevin was still living with his mother and stepfather. At that time, Bill owned an auto repair shop, and Diane had started a business on eBay, filling the rooms of the house with her merchandise. The couple felt they had fulfilled their duty of raising their children and were looking forward to enjoying life together. They even tried to officially evict Kevin from the house, but without a job, he had nowhere to go, and his mother always took him back in. So, the 3 of them continued living in the same house. August 15, 2010, was a Sunday in the quiet neighborhood of Seminole, Florida. The day began as usual, but the calm of the day didn't last long. Around 2 p.m., the Kain family's neighbors watched in shock through their windows as Bill and Kevin literally tumbled out of the house, continuing to fight on the front lawn. In an attempt to restrain his stepson, Bill tore his clothes, but Kevin managed to grab Bill's cell phone from his pocket and called 911. To the witnesses, it seemed like the fight lasted an eternity, but in reality, the stepfather and stepson only struggled for a few minutes. Finally, Kevin managed to break free from Bill's grip and ran to the neighbors, dressed only in his underwear. Bill went back into the house and also called 911. The police arrived at the house within minutes. Inside, they found Diane dead. She was lying on the bed in the bedroom, face up. The paramedics who arrived at the scene noticed that her body was already cold, indicating that she might have been killed before the emergency calls were made. An autopsy later revealed that she had been strangled. Kevin told the police that he had laid down to rest on the couch because he was recovering from recent surgery when his stepfather woke him up by slapping him directly on his head scar. Bill stated that Diane wanted to talk to Kevin and had asked him to come up to her bedroom. Kevin responded that he wasn't feeling well and would come up later. However, Bill soon returned and demanded that his stepson go upstairs immediately. Kevin complied, but as soon as he tried to open the bedroom door, Bill attacked him from behind and put him in a chokehold. Kevin managed to notice that his mother was lying motionless on the bed, her face almost black and blue. He called out to her, but of course, she didn't respond. After freeing himself from Bill's grip, the young man ran downstairs, with Bill following. The struggle continued in the kitchen, and then the two men tumbled out into the street, where astonished neighbors watched the fight. There, Bill tore Kevin's shirt and shorts, but before that, Kevin managed to grab his phone from Bill's pocket and called 911. He then ran to the neighbor's house, telling them that his stepfather had killed his mother, and waited with them until the police arrived. When the police questioned Bill, he told a completely different story. According to him, that day started like any other. Bill mowed the lawn and cleaned the pool. Later, he and Kevin planned to watch NASCAR, but Kevin went upstairs to talk to Diane. Apparently, they began arguing. Bill heard Diane yelling at Kevin and assumed she had just scolded him harshly, but then it got very quiet. 5 to 10 minutes later, he went upstairs to see what was happening. When he entered the room, Bill claimed he saw Kevin leaning over his mother, strangling her. Acting quickly, Bill grabbed Kevin's hands and pushed him out of the room. The fight continued in the kitchen and then spilled out into the street. Bill tried to restrain his stepson but complained that Kevin was stronger and was tossing him around like a rag doll. When Kevin finally ran down the street, Bill didn't chase after him. Instead, he returned to the house and called 911 from the kitchen. He claimed he didn't go back upstairs to check if his wife was alive or possibly still breathing, though he told the operator that he was with Diane and that she definitely wasn't breathing. Naturally, the police took both men in for questioning. Meanwhile, the officers interviewed the neighbors about what they had witnessed. As one neighbor was about to leave after giving her statement, she sighed and said, "It's terrible that this is the second wife who has died in that house." This was a surprising twist the police hadn't anticipated. In cases like this, suspicion often falls on the spouse. What was unusual here was that Bill had already lost a wife just 8 months before meeting Diane. At the time of her death in 2000, Krista, 44, and Bill, 42, had been married for 22 years and had raised 5 children in the same house where Kevin and Diane would later move in. On the morning of Easter Sunday in 2000, Bill found his wife in the pool. As he pulled her out of the water, their daughter called an ambulance, but it was already too late. Bruises were found on Krista's head, and investigators concluded that she had gone outside at night, tripped, hit her head, and fell into the pool. Bill was never considered a suspect. Her death was ruled accidental. After his wife's death, Bill received a $200,000 insurance payout. This was just one of several insurance payments Bill had received over the years. It seemed Bill Kain had incredible bad luck both in his personal life and in his business ventures. His auto repair shop and a property he had invested in both burned down, and he also received insurance payouts for them. At least one of these incidents was suspected to be arson, though it couldn't be proven. Each of these incidents, taken individually, didn't seem suspicious. However, the overall picture was quite unusual. What further fueled suspicion was that Diane had been insured for $750,000. Bill was asked to take a polygraph test, which he failed, lying about 2 key aspects of Diane's murder and what he claimed to have found his stepson doing to her. Regarding the DNA evidence, no DNA from Kevin, who Bill claimed was strangling his mother, was found on Diane's neck. However, her husband's DNA was present on her neck. The police had to dismiss the DNA evidence because the couple shared a bed, loved each other, and it wasn't unusual to find a husband's DNA on his wife. Bill was interrogated 3 times. Initially, he denied returning to the bedroom after the fight with his stepson, but during the 911 call, he clearly stated that he was with his wife, trying to help her. When this discrepancy was pointed out during the 3rd interrogation, he admitted to entering the room but lied about never going back into the bedroom. His contradictory statements raised further suspicions. Adding to the suspicion was Bill's history of interactions with the police. Between 1975 and 2014, he was arrested 4 times for driving under the influence. So, Bill didn't seem to be an innocent bystander, and he was aware of this himself. However, once investigators started to believe he was the prime suspect in his wife's murder, they uncovered something they hadn't known before. Before Diane's murder, the police had been called to the family home several times, and Kevin Kain was involved in these incidents. Kevin had always had a volatile temper, and despite some initial sympathy, his relationship with his stepfather deteriorated. He often behaved like an immature child, provoking his stepfather by saying, "Try to hit me, and I'll call the police and get you arrested." He frequently called the police himself, and each time, officers found that despite Kevin's complaints, he was the problem. However, in recent times, his behavior worsened, and he began showing aggression even toward his mother, insulting her. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the 23-year-old couldn't hold down a job, constantly complaining of headaches and preferring to spend entire days on the computer. Diane believed her son was simply lying about his health to avoid working. To Diane's horror, she discovered that Kevin had a brain tumor when she took him to the hospital. He had undergone surgery a month before the murder. However, he had barely begun to recover when his mother and stepfather once again demanded that he find a job and a place of his own to live. Then, just weeks before the deadline to move out, Diane was murdered. The evidence collected at the crime scene, including 5 small drops of blood found on Diane's leg and the blanket, as well as Kevin's shoes and glasses near the bed, played a crucial role in the investigation. Despite Kevin's claims that he never entered the bedroom, forensic analysis revealed that the shoes and glasses belonged to him. Realizing he was the prime suspect, Kevin voluntarily took a polygraph test and passed it without issue. However, the presence of his belongings in the bedroom raised suspicions. Additionally, no DNA from Kevin was found on his mother's neck, and Bill never mentioned that Kevin was wearing gloves during the fight. Nevertheless, due to Kevin's aggressive behavior during the fight, compared to Bill's calm and composed demeanor, investigators viewed Kevin as the more likely suspect. The prosecutor, unsure if the evidence against Kevin was sufficient, decided to present the case to a grand jury. If they found the evidence lacking, Kevin would be released. Kevin's attorneys believed he could testify in his own defense. However, unbeknownst to Kevin, the prosecutor had just received the lab report on the blood drops found on the blanket and Diane's leg. When Kevin took the witness stand, the prosecutor directly asked him how he could explain the presence of his blood in the room if he claimed he had not entered. Kevin was caught off guard and couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation. This confusion proved costly, as he was subsequently charged with first-degree murder, and the case went to trial. Given the stark differences in the men's stories and motives, the prosecution heavily relied on the physical evidence. They could not explain how Kevin's blood ended up in the room if he hadn't entered it, while Kevin bore visible scratches from the fight with Bill. The fact that Kevin didn't mention wearing gloves and the presence of his personal belongings in the room painted a suspicious picture. Kevin's defense argued that Bill was the murderer, with a clear motive: the $750,000 insurance payout. However, the jury wasn't informed about the death of Bill's previous wife or the other insurance payouts he had received in the past. The jury also didn't hear Kevin's 911 call, only Bill's. Ultimately, the jury found nothing suspicious in Bill's behavior and saw no reason to doubt Kevin's guilt. They convicted Kevin of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Kevin's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, confident in their client's innocence and believing that the appeal would be granted. The issue was that the prosecutor was allowed to tell the jurors about the constant conflicts between Kevin and Bill. Since Kevin often called the police to harass his stepfather, the prosecution argued this showed Kevin was a troublemaker. They also claimed that Kevin's call after his mother's murder was no different from his previous calls, where he allegedly tried to blame his stepfather. The prosecutor argued that this information wasn't significant to the case. Kevin's defense team seized on this argument, asserting that the negative perception of Kevin had been formed in the jurors' minds due to this information. They argued that Kevin's disputes with his stepfather were irrelevant to any anger he might have had toward his mother or the circumstances of her murder. Moreover, if this information wasn't essential to the case, it should have been excluded, and a new trial should be conducted. This effectively tied the hands of the appeals court, allowing for another trial. The second trial took place in early 2015, in the same courtroom, with the same judge, the same prosecutor, and the same prosecution strategy. However, Kevin's lawyers were much more assertive this time, directly accusing Bill of being the killer. Additionally, Kevin took the stand and openly admitted that, at 23 years old, he had been immature, unpleasant, and rude, even to his mother. He also stated that his mother meant everything to him, giving him no reason to harm her. While he left some room for doubt, he added that when he opened the bedroom door, he might have taken 2 steps inside but insisted he didn't approach the bed. Interestingly, despite the prosecutor's emphasis on Kevin's blood in the bedroom, the prosecution still couldn't explain how it got there. There was no blood under Diane's nails, no sharp objects in the room, and no signs that Kevin was bleeding before the fight with his stepfather. If Bill had scratched him while trying to pull him away from Diane, there should have been blood on the stairs, in the kitchen, and outside where the fight continued. However, it was evident that Bill only scratched Kevin outside, and since Kevin didn't return to the house, the prosecution's expert had to speculate on what might have happened. Their theory suggested that Kevin spat or coughed blood onto the blanket and his mother's leg. Of course, this theory seemed implausible. Kevin wasn't sick enough to cough up blood while killing his mother. So, where did these tiny drops come from? The defense had a version that seemed more logical and consistent with the evidence. Forensic experts analyzed the hands of Diane, Bill, and Kevin, and the only foreign DNA found was Kevin's under Bill's nails. After the fight, Kevin ran to the neighbors and waited there for the police, while Bill entered the house with Kevin's blood on his fingers. It doesn't take a genius to deduce what happened next. However, the defense couldn't secure the support of an independent expert due to a lack of funds, as Kevin was represented by court-appointed attorneys. Therefore, the jurors only heard from the prosecution's expert. Nevertheless, this time the jurors found reasons to doubt, something their predecessors hadn't done, and Kevin was released from prison after several years. When the verdict was delivered, Bill was present in the courtroom with his new wife. He had married for the 3rd time, this time to a woman named Tanya. Unfortunately, this marriage didn't last long, as Tanya passed away from cancer in 2017. The following year, Bill published an autobiography in which he described all his losses. The book was titled Love That Lasts a Lifetime. A year later, he was charged with fleeing the scene of an incident after crashing his motorcycle into a group of cyclists, resulting in one of them ending up in the intensive care unit. However, Bill wasn't the only one who found himself in legal trouble again. Kevin, who had reverted to his original last name, Cakes, and had vowed to become the person his mother wanted him to be, was arrested in 2016 after a fight in a pool hall where he struck his opponent with a billiard triangle. He later settled in Sarasota, Florida, and seemed to be living a relatively quiet life. The murder of Diane Kain remains unsolved. Her husband and son continue to accuse each other. The prosecution, naturally, insists that they didn't make a mistake with the killer and have no intention of filing charges against Bill, even in the light of any new evidence. On a cold September morning in 1994, 18-year-old Bonnie Craig left home with a backpack on her shoulders. 3 times a week, the University of Alaska student would wake up very early to make sure she didn't miss her first class. She took pride in never being late for her studies. But that day, Bonnie didn't show up for her classes. Later that same day, another university student was taking photos in a scenic park when they made a horrifying discovery. Bonnie Kristen Craig was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, on March 30th, 1976. At the age of 3, Bonnie's father was replaced by her stepfather, Gary Campbell, who became a father figure to her and her older brother. Gary adored the children, and soon Bonnie had 2 more siblings, Adam and Samantha. They always looked up to their beloved older sister, who was loving, kind, and full of life. Bonnie excelled in everything she set her mind to, especially in academics and sports. She became the first girl at her university to participate in wrestling. Due to Gary's job, the family moved frequently, and Bonnie attended 8 different schools, teaching her to adapt quickly to new environments. Even though Karen and Gary decided to divorce a few years later, Bonnie adored her stepfather and chose to live with him. Additionally, Gary's house was just 15 minutes away from the university where Bonnie enrolled. She chose to major in psychology at the University of Alaska in chilly Anchorage. Not everyone would call Alaska a paradise, but Bonnie and her siblings liked it much more than California or Texas. One of the reasons Bonnie may have wanted to live in Alaska was her boyfriend, Cameron Miyake. He was a year older than her, and they seemed made for each other. After graduating from a school in Anchorage, Cameron went to California to study architecture, but they kept in touch through phone calls and emails. Unfortunately, Bonnie's life was not entirely free of dark clouds. At a very young age, she experienced a profound tragedy. Her best friend died in an accident involving a drunk driver, an event that deeply affected Bonnie and unexpectedly influenced future events. After her friend's death, Bonnie vowed never to drink alcohol or drive. She categorically refused to drive, preferring to walk or use public transportation. Fortunately, Gary's house was close to her university, which was very convenient. She would take the public bus to her classes 3 times a week and walk the 3 kilometers from her father's house to the bus stop. On the other days, she worked part-time at a supermarket. The route to the bus stop partially passed through a remote road and could be dangerous, especially for a girl walking alone in the dark before dawn. Bonnie was aware of the hidden dangers and even told her sister that she always needed to carry pepper spray. She had one, but would it be enough if someone attacked her with the worst intentions? On the morning of September 28, 1994, Bonnie woke up at 5 a.m., got ready, and, as usual, headed to the bus stop. It was a 45-minute walk, so even though classes started at 7 a.m., she always left early to make sure she wasn't late. Samantha, her sister, heard Bonnie getting up and hurriedly preparing for her classes. She was sure Bonnie had made it to her English class, for which she had been preparing all night. 9 hours later, another student was taking photos on a trail in Chugach State Park, south of Anchorage. The park, located 25 kilometers from Bonnie's house, offered stunning photographic opportunities. When the student focused their camera on the picturesque landscape, something caught their attention. Something was floating in the water below a 10-meter cliff, and this bright blue object seemed unnatural against the white, fast-moving water. As the girl focused more closely, she realized with horror that it was a woman. Her lifeless body was floating in the shallow river. In 1994, the girl didn't have a mobile phone, of course, so she ran to the parking lot, got into her car, and drove to the nearest phone, where she dialed 911. Alaska State Troopers responded to the call. The woman, still very young, was floating face down at the base of a high cliff. Today, in 2023, there's a barrier at that cliff, but in 1994, it didn't exist. So, if someone had been walking there, tripped, and fallen, they could have easily suffered a fatal injury. Initially, the police thought that's what had happened. The forensic expert made a preliminary conclusion that Bonnie had drowned but also suffered several severe head injuries, possibly during the fall. She didn't have a purse or backpack with her, but there was a ring, Bonnie Craig's university ring. The police needed to contact her family, and by the time the officers were sure it was Bonnie and knocked on the family's door, it was 10 p.m. Gary, Samantha, and Adam were waiting for Bonnie to come home at any moment. The children were listening on the stairs when they saw their father fall to his knees and break down in tears. Hearing the officers' words, they realized something had happened to their sister, but they hoped she was in the hospital and that everything would be okay. That wasn't the case. Bonnie's mother, Karen, was on vacation on a yacht in Florida with her new boyfriend at the time. She never for a moment believed the police report that her daughter might have died while walking in the park when she was supposed to be in class. How did she get there without a car, and why did she go there in the first place? She thought it was nonsense. She was convinced it wasn't her daughter. However, when she arrived for the identification, she had to admit it was Bonnie lying on the morgue table. But Karen noticed something else. There were clear defensive wounds on her daughter's arms. She immediately asked the officers if they had collected any evidence at the crime scene. However, they responded that it was just an unfortunate accident and there was nothing to collect. Had she been assaulted? Where were her belongings? Karen had many questions, but the investigators weren't willing to share information with her. Karen, who had worked as a reporter, knew exactly what to do. Karen turned to the media, giving interviews and drawing as much attention as possible to her daughter's case, insisting that it had been murder. The police asked her to stop and not interfere with the investigation, but what investigation could there be if her daughter's death was being treated as an accident? She continued to make noise persistently. In reality, the detectives were investigating the case as a homicide but didn't want to reveal this to Bonnie's family or the media. They chose this tactic because they believed the crime was committed by someone close to the victim, possibly even a family member or the boyfriend, and they feared that if the perpetrator sensed danger, they might go into hiding. After performing an autopsy, the forensic expert concluded that Bonnie had been murdered, receiving 11 blows to the head with an unidentified object. She had a broken finger and abrasions on intimate parts of her body. Traces of semen were found on her body and clothing. Additionally, an officer discovered a piece of paper with a drop of blood about 2 meters from the edge of the cliff. The presence of blood in that location wouldn't have occurred in an accident. This indicated that something had happened before she fell off the cliff. However, there were no other pieces of evidence or signs of a struggle. At least 2 people saw Bonnie walking toward the bus stop, but there was no evidence she boarded the bus. The police concluded that the killer intercepted her while she was walking along the road in the dark. The officers requested DNA, fingerprints, and hair samples from all family members. Karen was surprised by the need for the children's samples. Then, an officer confessed that they actually needed Gary's sample, but that it would look suspicious if they only took his DNA. Karen began to wonder if Gary could be connected to Bonnie's death. According to Gary, Bonnie had told him she wanted to be buried in Canada, but maybe he wanted to send her body far away from Anchorage. Additionally, on the day of her death, he wasn't supposed to be home. He was on a business trip and returned early for some unclear reason. He had also been upset when Bonnie didn't return home on time, even though she was supposed to be watching her younger siblings. But could he have been so angry that he would hurt her? Gary had always treated Bonnie like his own daughter, but doubts began to form in Karen's mind. However, the DNA analysis didn't yield any matches. Moreover, Samantha and Adam, the younger children, claimed that on the morning of the murder, their father was at home, clearing ice off the car before heading to work. While the police were collecting DNA samples from almost every man Bonnie had interacted with, Karen decided to conduct her own investigation, as the officers were avoiding her and not sharing information. Frustrated, Karen decided to retrace her daughter's steps. At 5 a.m., she left from Gary's house to understand where Bonnie might have been abducted. The first part of the route seemed relatively safe, with houses and streetlights on both sides of the road, and she could walk on the larger sidewalks without getting too close to the road. However, soon the houses and sidewalks disappeared, and Karen found herself walking along a road surrounded by dense woods. There, Karen encountered a moose. Running into a moose in Alaska is quite common, but when these animals defend their territory, they can behave quite aggressively. Karen didn't know what to do and hid behind a streetlight. The moose eventually left, but another problem arose. Two people stopped to help Karen, a truck driver and a police officer. This gave Karen something to think about. Of course, Bonnie would never have gotten into a stranger's car, but if she had been attacked by a wild animal, she might have accepted a ride out of desperation. On the other hand, it would have been risky for the killer, as the road was patrolled by police officers. Karen was shocked at how dangerous the path her daughter took in the dark several times a week was, but she understood that Bonnie never complained because she didn't want her mother to worry and forbid her from living with her stepfather, as the house had become her home. In January 1995, 5 months after Bonnie's death, and seeing Karen's persistence, the police gave her what she desperately needed. They allowed her to see the forensic report but did not permit her to discuss it with anyone. The report confirmed what Karen already knew: her daughter had been sexually assaulted and then murdered. Now, the police were searching for a DNA match, but there was a problem. CODIS, the FBI's DNA database, was in its infancy. It had been launched 4 years before Bonnie's death and wouldn't be fully operational until 1998. This meant that until the police found a suspect, they wouldn't get a match. After ruling out Gary and Cameron as suspects, since Cameron was in a different state, the investigators discovered that one of Bonnie's coworkers at the market was excessively infatuated with her. Bonnie had even complained to her manager about the guy after he used a work computer to find out her phone number. He wouldn't stop calling her despite all her requests for him to stop. Another coworker missed a work meeting scheduled around the same time Bonnie was murdered. Both men provided DNA samples, but they turned out to be false leads. At the same time, Karen unexpectedly discovered that she might have a connection to her daughter's murder. It turned out that for the past 3 years, she had been working as a reserve officer in the Anchorage Police Department. Reserve officers are called in when the police need additional assistance, and Karen was used for undercover operations, posing as a buyer of illegal substances to catch dealers. The police went to great lengths to hide her identity during these operations, ensuring that no one saw her face or heard her voice. However, after the arrest of 7 associates of a local criminal organization, a fellow officer secretly shared his thoughts with her. He was convinced that after Karen participated in the arrest, the gang leader targeted her family. The informant explained that Bonnie might have been murdered as a message to the Anchorage Police Department, urging them to back off. Perhaps the criminals wanted to eliminate Karen because she had lived at that address, and her daughter could have easily been mistaken for her, especially in the dark. Of course, Karen immediately reported this to the detective working on Bonnie's case, but she didn't like the response she received. After sharing all the information, the detective seemed more interested in knowing the source of her information than in the theory itself. He accused her of interfering with the investigation and refused to pursue her lead. Years later, Karen was convinced that the detectives had dismissed that lead, but she was mistaken. A year later, Karen unexpectedly learned that the police were working on a new lead. Bonnie's English professor, whose class she planned to attend that morning, contacted the police. The professor told them that one of Bonnie's classmates might be responsible for her death. He had assigned his students to keep a journal, and he was alarmed by how dark and full of rage one student's journal was, especially when it mentioned the date of September 28th, the day Bonnie was murdered. The student wrote that it would be a tough day. What made him even more suspicious was that the student had skipped class for 7 hours that day, and when he later turned in his assignment to the professor, he was soaking wet, as if he had just come out of the shower, and smelled as if he had doused himself in an entire bottle of cologne. After reading the student's journal, Karen was convinced she had found a lead on her daughter's killer. If he attended classes at the same time as Bonnie, she might not have been afraid to get into his car, and the cologne could have masked the smell of pepper spray. It was the most significant lead she had found. Karen asked the investigators to examine the journal, but the police responded that they had already taken a DNA sample from the student and would only look at the journal if there was a match. This approach made sense in terms of saving police time and resources, but Karen wondered what would happen if there had been 2 attackers and only one had assaulted Bonnie. Disappointed with the police's response, Karen once again took it upon herself to investigate the life of the suspicious student. She discovered that the student had been charged with assault but was released on bail, which was paid by his friend, who had also been charged with murder. In other words, the student was associating with questionable individuals. Furthermore, he had shown up at the crime scene in the park when the police were removing Bonnie's body. Upon learning all this, Karen concluded that the student's friend had committed the murder, and she imagined how the 2 suspects would soon be arrested. But a few weeks later, the sergeant informed her that the DNA didn't match. Karen's disappointment was overwhelming, though she remained convinced that somehow one of the student's associates was connected to her daughter's murder. The investigation had come full circle, and detectives were left hoping for a breakthrough in Bonnie's daily routine. Around 5:20 a.m. that day, a girl delivering newspapers saw Bonnie and described her clothing. Another witness noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of Bonnie's house with the engine running. An anonymous informant reported seeing Bonnie talking with 2 dark-haired men in a car at a bus stop. But the most intriguing testimony came from a retired surgeon who regularly jogged in the mornings. He saw a girl matching Bonnie's description at 10 a.m., walking with 2 boys and another girl. The man provided a detailed description of Bonnie's clothing: a blue denim jacket, a white scarf, white or khaki jeans, and white sneakers. He couldn't recall the color of her shirt, but he recognized her due to his medical knowledge. Bonnie had an epicanthic fold, a skin fold of the upper eyelid, often referred to as a Mongolian fold. He saw Bonnie on the street and later recognized her in a newspaper photo. The police investigated all these leads, but the investigation didn't progress. 3 years after the case, a significant lead emerged, primarily related to DNA. The new suspect was the driver of the same bus that Bonnie was supposed to take. Several women and girls had accused the driver of harassment. Before this, he had worked as a substitute teacher in Pennsylvania, where he was fired for making inappropriate comments to female students. Shortly after Bonnie's murder, the man moved to California, but the most crucial aspect was the possible DNA match. The man's lawyer immediately demanded another test using more advanced technology, and it turned out to be another false lead. The semen found on Bonnie's body belonged to another man. Additionally, the bus driver had an alibi. Why did the initial DNA samples match? Because the comparison was initially made using 12 markers. Over time, the technology became more sophisticated, providing much more accurate information. 12 years had passed since that morning when Bonnie left her home and never returned. The investigation was being handled by a cold case team when they were notified of a DNA match. The police immediately informed Karen, who received the news with skepticism. Karen quickly asked if the DNA analysis could be trusted this time. When they assured her they were 100% certain, a whirlwind of questions raced through her mind. Who was the new suspect? Did he work with her daughter, go to school with her, or know one of her classmates? But the answer stunned her because it was something she hadn't even imagined. It wasn't someone the officers had already questioned. The suspect had come to the attention of the Alaska police solely because of the Cody's DNA database. He had long since left the state and was currently serving time in a New Hampshire prison. The suspect's name was Kenneth Dion, and in 1994 he was 25 years old, making him 7 years older than Bonnie. He was arrested in New Hampshire in connection with a robbery in 2003, but his DNA sample wasn't added to the database until 2006. Investigators immediately flew to New Hampshire. During the interrogation, Kenneth remained relaxed and answered questions as if he were an old friend of the officers. He didn't ask why detectives from Alaska had flown all the way there to speak with him. Kenneth shared that he was deeply involved in Oriental martial arts and had placed 10th in a World Wrestling Championship. He loved using nunchakus and sayas, which he always carried in his car. The detective gradually steered the conversation toward what interested him most, and Kenneth revealed that in 1994 he was married and had just welcomed a daughter. He confessed that his family had been the best thing in his life, but everything spiraled out of control when he started using drugs. Although he managed to quit briefly and enlist in the military, he was discharged while serving in Anchorage due to drug-related issues. The detective casually asked if Kenneth kept up with the news while living in Alaska and if he remembered a girl named Bonnie. Kenneth visibly tensed, but her name and photo didn't trigger any memories. After all, where could a married man and drug user have met an 18-year-old diligent freshman student? That was the question the detectives had to figure out. Kenneth eventually realized where the investigators were headed and requested a lawyer. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. They discovered that Kenneth had been released on parole 2 months before Bonnie's murder and was arrested again 2 months later for violating his parole conditions. In total, he had been charged with crimes 18 times, 8 of which were felonies. According to his ex-girlfriend, Kenneth boasted that he could kill someone and get away with it, and he supposedly had killed someone in Alaska, which is why he couldn't return there. The prosecutor wasn't sure if there was enough evidence for a conviction, so they offered Kenneth a plea deal with a 75-year prison sentence, which he rejected. In 2007, he was charged with first and second-degree murder and assault of Bonnie. He couldn't be charged with kidnapping because the statute of limitations had expired. The extradition process and legal complexities took a long time, but finally, in 2011, Kenneth appeared before a judge in Alaska. Kenneth's lawyers acted persistently and aggressively. They built their version of events around the idea that on September 28th, there was an unfortunate accident. Bonnie Craig was walking in the park, tripped, and fell, and Kenneth wasn't even near the park that day. As indirect evidence, they cited the words of a newspaper delivery girl and other witnesses, none of whom claimed to have seen a red-haired man or his black Ford Tempo. Additionally, the defense argued that if Kenneth had struck the girl 11 times in the head, there should have been a significant amount of blood at the scene. Regarding the DNA found on Bonnie's body, clothes, and pants, Kenneth claimed that he indeed knew Bonnie and that they had consensual intimate relations before the day of the incident. Essentially, the defense tried to paint a picture in which Bonnie was leading a double life and was involved with other men behind her boyfriend Cameron's back. But this theory seemed implausible. The defense's version didn't explain how Bonnie got to the park without a car, where she left her backpack, or why she didn't shower or change clothes for several days, especially since Kenneth's semen was found on her clothing and pants. On the other hand, the prosecutor faced a daunting task. The only solid piece of evidence linking Kenneth to the murder was the DNA. There were no witnesses, no apparent motive, and no murder weapon. Even establishing that a murder had occurred was a complex effort. The forensic expert testified that Bonnie had been struck 11 times on the head and that the injuries were consistent with being hit by an object, which couldn't have resulted from a fall off a cliff. There was also a drop of blood found on a leaf at the edge of the cliff, indicating that something had happened there. Remarkably, the family wasn't even aware of this piece of evidence. They only discovered it 16 years later. As for why only one drop of blood was found at the crime scene, the prosecutor's theory was that the attack on Bonnie began in the car. Presumably, she tried to defend herself using her self-defense skills, but Kenneth, with a black belt in Oriental martial arts, overpowered her. He then took her to the park, assaulted her, and she managed to escape, either by jumping or falling into the water. Kenneth then followed her and used nunchakus or a sickle to attack her until she succumbed. The jury believed the prosecution's version and found Kenneth guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 124 years in prison and would be eligible for parole at the age of 80. It was only during the trial that Karen saw the video of officers meticulously investigating the area near the cliff, on their knees, working through the water meter by meter. She realized that they had taken the investigation seriously from the beginning and had not treated the incident as an accident. For all those years, she had unjustly blamed them for inaction, even though they never stopped investigating. Additionally, Karen recognized the crucial role DNA played in this case and began actively advocating for states to collect DNA samples from all individuals incarcerated or arrested for serious crimes. Initially, only 6 states supported this idea. Karen presented her arguments to the then governor of Alaska, and within 12 days, they were able to draft and pass the corresponding law. Today, all states collect DNA samples from individuals accused of serious crimes. On February 28, 2018, the residents of Spain celebrated Andalusia Day as usual, and students enjoyed some extra days off. One of those happy schoolchildren was 8-year-old Gabriel Cruz. To keep him from getting bored, his father, Angel Cruz, decided to take him to his grandmother's house. Angel was divorced from Gabriel's mother, Patricia, but the former spouses maintained a warm relationship for the sake of their son. So, Gabriel's mother readily agreed to let him go to his grandmother's house, and Angel took the boy to his mother's home in Las Hortichuelas. On the morning of February 27, 2018, Gabriel spent his time playing with his cousins, who lived next door to his grandmother's house. Around lunchtime, Gabriel returned to his grandmother's house to eat, after which he started asking to be allowed to play with the girls again because he wanted to have some more fun. At first, his grandmother refused, as she needed to take a short nap, but Gabriel persisted. Finally, she gave in and let him go. She watched out the window and saw the boy running toward the girls. Their houses were only 100 meters apart, almost in a straight line. For Gabriel, it was common to run back and forth since they lived so close. The grandmother saw the boy disappear around the corner, indicating he had already reached the girl's house. It was a completely safe neighborhood where everyone knew each other and got along well, so she wasn't worried at all. Gabriel left the house around 3:30 to 3:45 p.m., but he never arrived at the relative's house. Since the relatives didn't know Gabriel was on his way to their house, they weren't alarmed. The grandmother also assumed he was still playing with his cousins. Therefore, the family only realized Gabriel was missing around 6 p.m. when the grandmother expected him for dinner, but he hadn't returned. The grandmother called Patricia and Angel, and the boy's parents decided to contact the police. An investigation began, and one of the initial hypotheses was that the boy had simply gotten lost. However, the parents couldn't believe this because Gabriel knew the area well, and the path from one house to the other was straightforward. Gabriel walked that route several times a day, making it unlikely he had gotten lost. Another theory suggested that a criminal gang had kidnapped the boy to demand a ransom. However, Gabriel's parents were simple workers, making it unlikely they could quickly gather a large sum of money. Through the media, Patricia and Angel made a plea to the kidnappers or anyone who knew of the boy's whereabouts. They shared that Gabriel was a very kind, obedient, and loving child. They affectionately called him Pescado because he loved the sea and, at his young age, dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. They cried and begged anyone who might know something about the boy's location to help, offering a €10,000 reward that friends, colleagues, and neighbors had gathered for the family. Volunteers distributed flyers describing the boy, who was wearing black pants, a white t-shirt, and a red hoodie. Meanwhile, search teams were formed, and the police combed every corner within a 6 and then 12-kilometer radius for several days. Helicopters, search dogs, and, of course, volunteers helped in the search for the boy. Among them was Ana Julia Quesada, Angel's girlfriend. She made a crucial discovery in this case. While searching with Angel, Ana Julia found a white t-shirt in some bushes 3.5 kilometers from the boy's grandmother's house. The shirt was lying near the Los Negros water treatment plant in a ravine. Ana recognized Gabriel's shirt because she had helped him dress that day. Laboratory tests confirmed that it had Gabriel's DNA. In other words, it was his shirt. But where was the rest of his clothing, and where was the boy himself? The public felt relieved by the discovery, but it was strange to the police because they had already searched that area and found nothing. Meanwhile, all the attention from journalists and the public focused on a 42-year-old man named Diego, who suddenly became the main suspect in the police investigation. Diego had a strong attraction to Patricia, Gabriel's mother. Initially, Patricia reciprocated his feelings, but soon the situation became overwhelming and obsessive. Diego fell in love with Patricia, constantly calling her, showing up at her workplace, and, worst of all, even going to Gabriel's school to intercept her there. Moreover, Diego suffered from psychological disorders, which led Patricia to seek a restraining order against him. Despite this measure, Diego didn't stop. Eventually, he was arrested, and upon release, he was fitted with an ankle bracelet to monitor his movements. Diego fit the profile of someone who might seek revenge. He knew the boy, knew his mother, and could potentially blackmail Patricia. Additionally, he exhibited enough signs of mental instability to commit such an act. Later, Diego managed to remove his ankle bracelet and continued calling Patricia. He was detained for violating the terms of his release, and the police searched his house and car. Everything seemed to point to Diego as the prime suspect at first glance. However, in reality, things were not as straightforward as they seemed. investigators quickly ruled out the idea that Diego could be the kidnapper. Firstly, he lived 40 kilometers away from where Gabriel disappeared. Additionally, the police found 3 witnesses who saw Diego on his balcony around 4:45 p.m. Considering Gabriel had left his grandmother's house shortly before 4:30 p.m., Diego couldn't have kidnapped the boy, hidden him somewhere, and returned home in such a short time. It was clear he couldn't be in multiple places at once. Therefore, for a while, investigators pretended that Diego was their main suspect, but secretly they focused on Ana Julia Quesada's behavior. One of the primary concerns for the investigators was that the t-shirt found by Ana was completely dry. This raised suspicions because it had been raining heavily for several days before the discovery. Although it wasn't raining on the day Ana found the shirt in the bushes, there should have been signs indicating that the shirt had been exposed to the rain for several days. This development put Ana Julia Quesada squarely in the investigators' sights. Additionally, she claimed to have found the t-shirt alongside Angel, but in reality, she discovered it while he was slightly behind her. It was also curious that Ana said she smelled Gabriel, which led her to find the t-shirt, even though the search teams hadn't been able to locate it before. Moreover, Ana seemed to exaggerate her concern for the boy, particularly when the cameras were on her. While she appeared agitated in public, at home, she showed no signs of distress. Her odd behavior was noticed not only by acquaintances but also by journalists and even Angel himself. Despite this, Ana continued to shed tears and display excessive anxiety. Interestingly, she and Gabriel had a problematic relationship, and he openly expressed his dissatisfaction with her. Although Gabriel was never rude or spoiled, he was honest with Ana. When asked for her phone, she claimed to have lost it, but when she supposedly found it, most of its contents had been deleted. However, all these elements were hardly conclusive evidence, so the police tried not to show their suspicions to avoid scaring Ana off. Subsequently, the investigators placed Ana under constant surveillance, intercepted her phone, and installed a listening device in her car. They now needed to set a trap to make her slip up and lead them to the boy. The investigators contacted Angel and Ana, asking for the key to a remote farmhouse owned by Angel, stating they wanted to conduct a search there the following day as a precaution. Angel agreed to give them the key and allowed them to search the farmhouse. In the early hours of March 11, 2018, Ana began acting suspiciously. She got into her car and headed to the farmhouse. Interestingly, at that moment, not only was she being followed by the police, but also by journalists who found her behavior strange. When she arrived at the farmhouse, she exited the car with a blanket, and upon returning, she was clearly carrying something wrapped in it. She placed the blanket in the trunk and headed back to the house where she lived with Angel. Just as she was about to enter the garage, the police stopped her. In the trunk of her car, they found Gabriel's body. The arrest was captured on video by neighbors, and Ana screamed that she didn't understand anything and that it wasn't her fault, claiming she had just taken the car that morning. However, at that moment, she didn't know she had been under constant surveillance. Interestingly, Angel had known for several days that the police suspected his girlfriend, but along with Patricia, he was asked to remain calm and not show any signs that Ana was the prime suspect. It was incredibly brave of him to handle the situation, and it must have been extremely difficult for him to sleep in the same house with someone who might have killed his son. During the interrogation, Ana Julia Quesada partially confessed to Gabriel's murder, but she claimed it was an accident. She said she intercepted Gabriel as he was heading to his cousin's house and suggested they go to the farmhouse to paint something, promising they would return quickly. Gabriel got into the car with her, and they arrived at the farmhouse. However, as her story unfolded, it became less believable. Anna claimed that Gabriel grabbed an axe and began shouting that he didn't like her, that he didn't want her to date his father, and that he wanted her to return to the Dominican Republic. She said that at some point, she put her hand on him and managed to take the axe away. Allegedly, he continued shouting at her, and she wanted him to be quiet, so she covered his mouth and nose with her hands. Anna cried and swore that it was an accident. However, the autopsy revealed that, in addition to being suffocated, Gabriel was also struck on the head and strangled for about 45 minutes, indicating a slow and agonizing death. Anna could have saved his life by calling for help, but she didn't. Afterward, Anna stripped Gabriel down to his underwear and buried his body in a shallow grave at the farmhouse, covering it with stones. She then returned to the car and drove back. On March 5th, she took Gabriel's belongings and threw them into a glass recycling bin in a nearby neighborhood. After falling into the police's trap, she hurried to the farmhouse, exhumed the body, wrapped it in a blanket, and placed it in the car's trunk. The police had installed several listening devices in Anna's car, which recorded her making derogatory comments about the boy on the way back. At one point, Anna lamented that they needed the boy and cursed him. It's unclear what she intended to do with Gabriel when she was detained, especially since she was planning to take him to the garage of the house where she lived with Angel. Initially, the police suspected that Anna might have had an accomplice, as they searched all the family cars, including those of Angel, Patricia, Anna, and other relatives, but they found no traces of soil or blood. However, they later dismissed this theory and only charged Anna. The motives for the crime could have been twofold: jealousy and money. First, Anna was jealous of Angel's relationship with his son and felt excluded from their close bond. Angel adored his son and, despite the separation, had a wonderful relationship with him. They co-parented Gabriel and remained united through him. When Anna planned another trip to the Dominican Republic, Angel rejected her request because he wanted to spend time with his son during that period. All these situations obviously deeply upset Anna. Secondly, there was a financial motive, partially evidenced by the fact that Anna was the one who insisted the most on increasing the reward for information about Gabriel's whereabouts. Additionally, the daughter of her former lover mentioned that Anna was very calculating and greedy, and there were incidents where she could have caused her former lover's death by withholding help when he was sick while they lived together. Anna arrived in Spain at the age of 21 and settled in Almeria. Before that, she worked as a prostitute in the Dominican Republic, where she met her ex-husband, a truck driver who decided to rescue her from that profession and brought her to Spain. The couple raised their daughter, but when they decided to move to Spain, they left Anna's older daughter, Josefina, who was 4 years old, in her homeland. Unfortunately, in 1996, Anna's older daughter died under mysterious circumstances. Her husband woke up one morning and went to the girls' room to check on them. He couldn't find Josefina but noticed a small table near the window. When he approached, he saw the girl lying on the asphalt below. She had fallen from the 7th floor. The police arrived but couldn't interrogate the mother, as she was in a state of shock. The case was ruled an accident. Now, after the revelation that Anna killed Gabriel, there is speculation that Anna might also be responsible for her daughter's death, but investigating the case after nearly 20 years is practically impossible, especially since an official decision had already been made ruling it an accident. The trial for Gabriel's case took place in 2019. The defense requested 3 years in prison for Anna for involuntary manslaughter, but that request was denied. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison. She could be eligible for parole after 25 years, meaning she could be released in 2044, but only if she demonstrates rehabilitation. Even if released, she will not be allowed to live in Nijar or come within 500 meters of Gabriel's parents. She is also required to pay the boy's parents €250,000 for moral damages and reimburse the state for the costs of the boy's search. In summary, Anna received the maximum punishment and is currently serving her sentence in prison. One might think that Gabriel's family could now move on and remember what a wonderful child he was, leaving behind the media frenzy. However, that has not been the case. Numerous online posts have appeared inviting people to visit certain websites to view the body of the deceased Gabriel. If one followed these links, they would see the face of a child, but it was actually the horribly mutilated body of another child. There have also been other attempts to gain likes or make money by exploiting images of children. This happens because the law does not protect the privacy of the deceased as it does the living. This unfortunate exploitation only adds to the pain and suffering of Gabriel's family, who have already endured unimaginable tragedy. Now, Gabriel's parents are fighting to ensure that the families of deceased children, whose images are being used in such a manner, have the right to demand the removal of those images or even entire websites. This campaign is crucial for protecting the dignity and memory of children who have passed away and for preventing further exploitation of their images for malicious purposes. Their efforts aim to close the legal loopholes that allow such exploitation and to give grieving families more control over how their loved ones are remembered and portrayed online. This fight is not just for Gabriel but for all families who have lost children and faced similar violations of their privacy and dignity. The hope is that by raising awareness and pushing for legal reforms, they can prevent other families from experiencing the additional pain caused by the misuse of their children's images. In 1985, a new fall semester began at a small college in Bonneville, Mississippi. However, the joy of reuniting with classmates was soon overshadowed by horrifying news. The police received a call from the college reporting that Stacy Pannell, an 18-year-old freshman, had been found brutally murdered in her dorm room. Within minutes, the police were at the crime scene. The room where the student was found was dimly lit by the faint glow of a decorative bar sign that served as an ornament. When the officers turned on their flashlights, they could see blood everywhere, on the girl's head, the floor, the bed, and even the walls. The initial examination of the body provided the investigators with little information. Stacy's shirt was pulled up, and her undergarments were displaced, held only by her left leg. It was evident that she had been raped and then murdered with a wooden rifle that lay on the floor next to the bed. This rifle belonged to Stacy herself, who used it during parades. The rifle was wrapped in a towel, as if the killer had attempted to wipe off their fingerprints. It was also notable that someone had cut the protective screen of the room's window. The other part of the screen lay on the ground directly beneath the window, outside. Investigators concluded that the killer had entered the room through the window, raped Stacy, and then killed her with her own rifle. Stacy Diane Pannell was the eldest of 3 children in her family. The 18-year-old student was described as a friendly girl, always willing to help a friend. She had been part of the school band during her high school years and was so passionate about it that she continued her involvement in the band at college. Overall, the impression was that everyone loved the freshman, but someone clearly wished her harm. The detectives began their investigation by interviewing Stacy's roommates, Amy Willer and Stephanie Lie Alexander. Amy recounted that she returned to the dorm around 2:30 a.m. She had left her keys in the room and couldn't get in, so she knocked on the door and called out Stacy's name, but there was no response. Amy then went to the neighboring room, 112, and knocked on the door. That day, Stephanie had been feeling unwell and had taken strong painkillers, which made her very drowsy. Nevertheless, Amy managed to wake her up, and Stephanie let her in. A unique feature of the dorm was that there was a shared bathroom between the 2 rooms, used by all the girls, and through it, Amy was able to enter her own room. Amy went in first and noticed Stacy lying on the bed. Turning to Stephanie, who was right behind her, Amy remarked that something was wrong with Stacy. One of Stacy's legs was hanging off the bed, and a pillow was resting on her head in such a strange position that Amy speculated Stacy might have had too much to drink. It was only when Amy tried to adjust Stacy to make her more comfortable that she noticed the bloodstains. She immediately contacted campus security. The autopsy of Stacy's body revealed a horrifying scene of what had occurred that night. The killer had struck her with the wooden rifle so violently that it fractured her skull and tore the skin near her ear. Stacy suffered numerous blows, but she didn't die instantly. Shockingly, there were almost no defensive wounds on her, indicating that she either didn't expect the attack or didn't have time to defend herself. To the police's surprise, the results showed that there had been no sexual assault on the young woman. However, it was evident that the perpetrator had touched her clothing while undressing her, potentially leaving a DNA sample. But in those years, DNA analysis wasn't yet conducted, and there were no fingerprint databases, so the police had to manually collect fingerprints from every guy who had ever entered the girl's room, such as those invited to parties, as well as from members of Stacy's band. The dormitory wasn't like a home where only a few family members lived. In a university, people constantly came and went. As a result, the forensic experts did extensive work, which unfortunately yielded no results. The police then turned to the FBI for help in creating a profile of the killer. They determined that the perpetrator was likely a strong, robust man between 20 and 24 years old. It was most likely that the killer had no prior criminal record or legal issues and had taken the opportunity to attack Stacy because he studied or worked at the university. With few leads to go on, investigators interviewed Stacy's roommates about what had been happening in her life before the murder. They discovered that she was dating a guy named Tommy Osborne, and after band practice that day, she met up with him as usual. The police searched Tommy's room, hoping to find some evidence, such as blood-stained clothing, weapons, or something similar, but none of that was found in his room. Additionally, there were no clues in Stacy's room linking Tommy to the murder, such as hair or fingerprints. Having ruled out Tommy as a suspect, the police asked Stacy's parents if she had any former friends or boyfriends she had recently broken up with, and they identified someone, Ben Cox, Stacy's high school boyfriend. The young couple dated all summer before Stacy went to college, and Ben even gave her a ring. However, when she got to college, Stacy decided she no longer wanted to be engaged to Ben, which upset him greatly, to the point where he refused to return the ring. Ben was subjected to 2 polygraph tests, but the results were inconclusive. Although Ben had a motive, it wasn't enough to link him to the crime. He also had an alibi. He was at home all night and went to bed around 11 p.m., as confirmed by his parents. Regarding physical evidence, the police found a hair on Stacy's bedding, but forensic experts couldn't determine who it belonged to. It could have been Ben's or someone else's. Stacy's family was convinced it wasn't him, as they believed he genuinely cared for her. Whoever the killer was, besides cleaning the murder weapon, left very few clues. The investigators spent months trying to solve the student's murder, but they didn't come any closer to making an arrest. Deciding to re-examine the crime scene, they returned to the cut screen in Stacy's room. Amy and Stephanie clearly stated that there had been no cut before the murder, meaning the killer definitely did it. It seemed like that must have been how he entered if he wanted to remain unseen. However, the cut turned out to be too small for a normal-sized person to slip through, let alone a strong young man. If the killer didn't enter through the window, why spend time tampering with the screen? This discovery raised new questions. It suggested that the screen might have been manipulated to mislead the investigators into thinking that was the point of entry. If the killer didn't enter through the window, it meant he had likely entered through the door, either by knocking or because he had a key, which significantly broadened the scope of suspects and made the case even more challenging. Upon closer examination, forensic experts noticed that the fiberglass fibers of the screen were pointing outward, indicating that the screen hadn't been cut to allow someone to enter but rather to simulate a point of entry. This suggested that the killer had tampered with the screen after the murder to divert attention and create the illusion that they had entered through the window, when in reality, they had likely used another means of access, possibly the front door. This new finding shifted the direction of the investigation, suggesting that the killer might have been someone Stacy knew and who could have had easy access to her room. The fact that the screen had been cut from inside the room meant there were only 3 possible options. The killer worked at the university and had a key, lived in the dormitory, or was let in by someone. With the case at a standstill, the police decided to seek the help of Steve Rice, the police chief of a suburb in Illinois, known for his skill in detecting lies based on body language. Rice planned to re-interview Amy, Stephanie, Tommy, and Ben. He began by questioning Amy, and after 45 minutes, he concluded that she wasn't making anything up or hiding anything. Next, it was Stephanie's turn. As Rice recalled, he started the conversation with Stephanie with a series of simple questions: name, address, phone number, date, and place of birth. As she answered, Rice closely observed her eyes, noticing that with each response, they shifted to the left. Finally, Rice asked Stephanie how Stacy had been murdered. This time, Stephanie's eyes moved to the right as she responded that she didn't know who had killed Stacy. Rice continued asking about the motive for the murder, and each time Stephanie's eyes shifted to the right, Rice interpreted it as a sign that she was lying. This led him to become more specific with his questions. When he asked her what time she went to bed, and Stephanie's eyes again moved to the right, Rice stopped her, telling her not to answer, suggesting that what she was about to say wasn't true. Rice began to lose patience, telling Stephanie that she was making everything up and that he wanted to hear the truth. Using pseudoscientific techniques based on neurolinguistic programming, NLP, which were relatively new at the time, Rice believed that Stephanie's eye movements indicated whether she was lying or telling the truth. According to this approach, it was thought that people moved their eyes in certain ways when they were fabricating responses and in different ways when they were recalling something true. Rice continued to press Stephanie for another 2 hours. Every time her eyes moved to the right, he interrupted her, and when they moved to the left, he allowed her to continue. In this manner, Rice managed to get Stephanie to confess, word by word, that she had killed Stacy in the heat of an argument, eventually signing a confession. In her confession, Stephanie stated that she had gone to Stacy's room to chat. The girls began arguing about their boyfriends. Stacy asked Stephanie what she thought of Tommy Osborne, and when Stephanie said she thought he was a good guy, Stacy exploded and demanded that she stay away from him. According to Stephanie, the argument escalated, and in a moment of rage, she committed the murder. In her confession, Stephanie claimed that Stacy insulted her harshly and slapped her, prompting Stephanie to retaliate in kind. Stacy then grabbed her by the neck and began strangling her. It was at that moment that Stephanie supposedly grabbed the rifle and struck Stacy on the head 3 times. With blood everywhere, Stephanie said she took a shower and changed her clothes. She then placed a pillow over Stacy's head, cut a section of the window screen, and burned the cut piece along with her shirt in the bathroom. Stephanie revealed where the knife used to cut the screen was located and confirmed that she tried to wipe off the rifle with a towel. She admitted that she was very scared and did all these things because she didn't want to go to jail. She was arrested and charged with murder. However, just a few days after her arrest, Stephanie declared her innocence, claiming that her confession had been illegally extracted through manipulation and coercion. The key issue was whether the jury would believe that Rice had manipulated Stephanie into confessing. The prosecutors were convinced the confession was genuine due to the specific details Stephanie revealed, which were not known to the public. Notably, she mentioned a knife that was found in a drawer. Although the investigators hadn't disclosed where they found it, Stephanie knew which drawer it was in. However, the police weren't certain that the screen had been cut with that knife. Additionally, since the knife was used by all the girls in the residence, it wasn't improbable that Stephanie knew where it was located. It's also important to note that the investigators themselves wrote Stephanie's confession, as the initial version wasn't even written in her own handwriting. At that time, Stephanie was still unwell and taking strong medication, which, according to her doctor, made her particularly vulnerable to police tactics and could have led to a false confession. Her lawyers wanted to demonstrate to the jury how easily she could be influenced, so they hired a psychologist who put her in a hypnotic state to review the events of that night. Despite all the efforts of her lawyers, in January 1988, the jury concluded that Stephanie had killed her neighbor in the heat of an argument. They found her guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Stephanie served only 9 years before being released, but she continues to maintain her innocence. Today, Stephanie Alexander and her lawyers not only claim that all the forensic evidence points to a man, but they even name a potential killer, Charles Ray Crawford. Crawford was accused of several other crimes and is currently on death row for the kidnapping and murder of a student in Mississippi in 1993. In fact, there are many similarities between these two cases. Crawford kidnapped the girl from her home after entering by cutting the window screen. After abducting the student, he tied her to a tree, assaulted her, and then killed her. These similarities have led many to question whether Stephanie was truly guilty of Stacy's murder or if she was a victim of police manipulation and a false confession, while the real killer remained free until being caught years later. At least 2 witnesses saw Charles Ray Crawford in the area of the college on the night of Stacy Pannell's murder. Crawford lived nearby and was well acquainted with the campus. Modern analysis of Stacy's underwear revealed the DNA of a man, possibly left when the perpetrator touched her while removing it. Additionally, a hair identified as male was found on the bedding and the rifle that became the murder weapon. Investigators also discovered a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacy. Now, Stephanie's lawyers are fighting to have all the evidence re-examined with Crawford's DNA. Back in 1985, the main issue with the case was the lack of direct evidence linking Stephanie to Stacy's murder. There were no witnesses or conclusive physical evidence. Her fingerprints and hair samples were taken, but nothing indicated her involvement in the crime. That's when the police turned to Steve Rice, who had gained a reputation as a polygraph expert and body language analyst, although his methods are widely considered pseudoscientific and lack scientific backing. Rice claimed he could determine if a person was lying based on the direction their eyes were looking, a technique that has been widely discredited. During the interrogation, Rice didn't allow Stephanie to speak or finish a sentence, continuously pressuring her and asserting that she was lying whenever her eyes moved in a direction he deemed suspicious. The police argued that the few pieces of evidence they had corroborated Stephanie's confession and used it to secure her conviction. However, Stephanie, although she has served her time, continues to insist that she is paying for someone else's crime. Advances in DNA testing have brought new insight into the case. With the presence of male DNA at the crime scene that does not match Stephanie's, and the identification of Crawford as a potential suspect, the validity of her conviction is now being questioned. Stephanie and her lawyers' push to re-examine all the evidence with Crawford's DNA could finally uncover the truth and determine whether Stephanie was truly guilty or if she was the victim of a grave injustice. The case that emerged in South Dakota was unlike anything the investigators had encountered before, an apparently ordinary family with 3 suspects, each with a potential motive to commit a horrific crime. On the morning of Wednesday, February 8, 2006, Bonnie Burns, a resident of Wyoming, anxiously awaited a call from her 41-year-old daughter, Tammy Renee, who lived in Pierre, South Dakota. Tammy made it a point to call her mother every morning without fail, but that day, the sudden silence from her daughter alarmed Bonnie. Worried, Bonnie decided to call Tammy herself. The landline went unanswered, and Tammy's cell phone redirected the call to voicemail. Tammy also failed to show up at her job in the shoe department at Kmart. Unsure of what to do next, Bonnie remembered the name of one of her daughter's colleagues, Brian Clark. Tammy had recently mentioned to her family that she was frequently in touch with Brian, so Bonnie decided to contact him. When Bonnie called the store, Brian answered the phone, and he too was surprised because he didn't know where Tammy was either. Concerned, Brian suggested that Bonnie contact the police. He himself called 911 and reported Tammy's disappearance, adding that he suspected something criminal might have happened. When the dispatcher asked why he believed this, Brian revealed that he and Tammy were having an affair, and he suspected that her husband, Brad Renee, might have found out. Meanwhile, that same morning, Tammy and Brad's 12-year-old daughter, Haley Renee, sat down for breakfast but immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her father, Brad, was at the table, but her mother was nowhere to be seen. Tammy always took care of the kitchen in the mornings, but the house was unusually quiet. Haley walked to her mother's bedroom and noticed that all her belongings were still there, her purse, phone, and keys. Tammy's truck was parked in the garage. The young girl couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her mother wouldn't have left without taking her things. Confused, Haley quietly asked her father where her mother was. Brad responded in a puzzling manner, "Sweetheart, she's probably with her boyfriend. She'll be back in 2 days." Tammy and Brad had met in Billings, Montana. The young couple started dating immediately, and within a year, Tammy was expecting a child. For her, getting married and becoming a mother was a dream come true. However, over time, the relationship between Tammy and Brad began to deteriorate, especially when Tammy started an affair with Brian. This affair created tensions at home, and Tammy's disappearance raised suspicions about what had truly happened. With anonymous letters, spy devices, and false evidence muddying the waters, the detectives found themselves navigating a sea of unleashed passions within what seemed to be an ordinary American family. Each of the 3 suspects, the husband Brad, the lover Brian, and the daughter Haley, had a motive to want Tammy gone, but only one of them was truly guilty. The question was, could the investigators uncover the truth before it was too late? Tammy took care of Haley and managed the household, while Brad focused on his career. In 2004, Brad's hard work paid off when he was offered a promotion to assistant manager at Walmart, but this required the family to move to Pierre, South Dakota. Although Pierre was the administrative center of the state, the town had fewer than 14,000 residents and lacked significant entertainment options. One of the few notable attractions in Pierre was the dam and the adjacent lake, a popular spot for fishing and hunting. Despite the town's tranquility and picturesque setting, Brad was convinced to accept the offer. The move from a big city wasn't easy for the family, but after some time, life in the new place began to settle. Haley found a few sports clubs to join, and Tammy got a job at a store, where she met Brian Clark. Unlike Brad, who loved his wife but couldn't give her enough attention due to his work, Brian was always available for Tammy. The news that her mother had a boyfriend came as a shock to Haley. Although her parents had informed her 2 weeks earlier that they had decided to get a divorce, this revelation took her completely by surprise. Her parents had explained that Brad's job, which sometimes required him to work up to 100 hours a week, had taken a toll on their marriage. However, they promised to stay together until the end of the school year so the changes wouldn't affect Haley's education. Now, with her father announcing that her mother had a boyfriend, Haley didn't know what to think. After dropping Haley off at school, Brad headed to work. As soon as he arrived, 2 police officers approached him. When Brad heard that his wife had disappeared, he was stunned. He explained that he hadn't seen Tammy since the previous day. He had returned home from work after 10 p.m., and his daughter was already asleep. Tammy wasn't at home, and Brad assumed she had gone out or was nearby. Around 1 a.m., he noticed that she still hadn't returned, but he didn't think much of it, assuming she had decided to spend the night elsewhere. Brad's story raised several questions for the investigators. Why didn't Brad try to contact his wife when he noticed she wasn't home? Why wasn't he more concerned? Additionally, the mention of a supposed boyfriend of Tammy's further complicated the situation. With 3 suspects, the husband Brad, the lover Brian, and the daughter Haley, each with a possible motive, the detectives had to sift through anonymous letters, spy devices, and potentially false evidence to unravel the truth in the midst of a complex sea of emotions. Brad recounted to the detectives that, the night before, he had heard a car screech to a halt outside his house. When he looked out the window, he saw Tammy park her black truck, get into another car, and drive off with a man. Brad, who had recently discovered that his wife was seeing someone else, assumed it was Tammy's lover. Acting on a sudden impulse, Brad got into Tammy's truck and followed them, but soon the car his wife was in broke down, forcing Brad to pull over on the side of the road. A passing patrol officer stopped to help Brad, but by the time the car was running again, Brad had lost sight of his wife. He decided to return home and went to bed. The next morning, Tammy was still missing, and he assumed she had gone somewhere with the other man. The detectives listened intently to Brad's account of the previous night's events. Brad, the store manager, was a small-statured man with a timid appearance who didn't seem threatening, and his behavior didn't indicate any signs of lying. The police asked if Tammy might have returned home already, and Brad agreed to accompany them back to his house. However, this was a ruse by the officers, who had already been inside the house and noticed something suspicious through the garage window. When Brad allowed them to search his home, one officer went inside while the other headed directly to the garage. There, he noticed a reddish-brown stain on the door of Tammy's truck. As he got closer, he saw blood dripping from the vehicle's threshold. There was too much blood, and when the officer opened the door, he was nearly overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. This discovery drastically changed the course of the investigation, pointing towards a much darker scenario. Everything pointed to a crime having occurred, but the officers didn't want to alarm Brad, who could demand that the search be stopped at any moment. The police decided to use another tactic. They asked Brad to accompany them to the station for some additional questions, and while he was away, they would request an official search warrant. At the same time, during Brad's interrogation, the police spoke with Haley. The young girl shared that her parents never argued and that her father spent every free moment with the family. This made the news of the divorce a complete shock to her. Haley also noted that the impending divorce had taken a toll on her father, who had been very irritable in recent days, barely eating, and had called Tammy multiple times, pleading for her help to save their marriage. Haley's statements, combined with the discovery of blood in Tammy's truck, strengthened the detectives' suspicions. As the investigation progressed, the police needed to determine whether Brad, desperate to prevent the divorce, had taken extreme measures to keep his wife or if there was another factor they hadn't yet considered. Meanwhile, Haley recalled that her mother, Tammy, had been acting normally in the days leading up to her disappearance. Tammy had told her family that the house would remain with her and Haley, and that Brad would be moving out. The family confirmed Haley's account. Tammy had been looking forward to the divorce and had already informed her relatives that the house would be hers and her daughter's. This information further complicated the case, suggesting a motive for Brad if he felt he was losing everything. Detectives now had to piece together whether Brad's desperation had driven him to commit a crime or if there was another explanation for Tammy's disappearance. At the police station, Brad fully cooperated, answering all questions. He admitted that his wife had recently confessed that she had fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce, but he insisted that he didn't know who that person was. He vehemently denied any involvement in Tammy's disappearance and insisted he had no idea where she might be. When the detectives informed him about the blood found in the car, Brad was visibly shocked. While Brad was being interrogated, the police obtained a search warrant for his home and meticulously examined every room. Everything appeared completely normal, except for the blood in Tammy's truck. It was the typical home of an ordinary family. However, the amount of blood found in the truck suggested that Tammy had been seriously harmed and was likely dead. In such a case, Brad became the prime suspect, given his wife's desire for a divorce, which provided him with a motive. The detectives questioned Brad for 5 hours until he insisted on having a lawyer. Although they weren't 100% certain that Tammy had been murdered, they couldn't release the suspect either, as he might destroy any remaining evidence. The police had no choice but to arrest Brad on a first-degree murder charge. While Brad Renee was under arrest, the investigators invited Brian Clark to the station. Brian arrived with his lawyer. Like Tammy, Brian also had a family, a wife and a daughter. He told the detectives that he had last seen Tammy the day before she disappeared. They had met at a motel, and then Brian dropped Tammy off at her home around 5 p.m. After that, he went to a basketball game with his wife and daughter and spent the rest of the evening and night at home. Brian's alibi seemed solid, but his involvement with Tammy and the fact that she had last been seen with him kept him under scrutiny. The detectives now had to verify his story and determine whether Brad's shock was genuine or part of a cover-up, while also considering Brian's possible role in the case. Brian mentioned that his wife could confirm his alibi, but he also requested that his affair with Tammy be kept secret, as his wife was unaware of the extramarital relationship. This raised doubts among the detectives. Although Brian seemed genuinely concerned for Tammy, his decision to immediately appear with a lawyer aroused suspicion. The situation became more complicated as both men, Brad and Brian, had possible motives for being involved in Tammy's disappearance. While one appeared distressed and cooperative, the other came prepared with legal representation. The police now had to thoroughly investigate the alibis of both men and search for additional evidence that could determine who, if either, was the real culprit. The fact that Brian's wife didn't know about his infidelity provided a potential motive for murder. Perhaps, if Tammy had confessed to Brian that she wanted him to come clean, she might have demanded that he tell his wife the truth, or in a more extreme scenario, she might have threatened to speak to her directly, which could have driven Brian to desperation. Additionally, although Brad had access to Tammy's truck, if his story about following his wife was true, Brian could have killed her and soaked the truck in blood to frame Brad. The police tracked down the patrol officer who had stopped to help Brad start his car, and he confirmed Brad's account word for word. With this confirmation, the police began to question Brad's guilt, but they still couldn't rule out any possibilities. However, without a body, the case couldn't move forward significantly. The detectives were left with two strong suspects, both with potential motives and both connected to Tammy. The challenge now was to uncover concrete evidence or find Tammy, dead or alive, to solve the mystery. On February 9th, search teams began combing the vast area surrounding the city. This was a region rarely visited except by hunters who frequented the rugged shores from October to January. If Tammy was out there, it was unlikely anyone would find her before the start of the next hunting season or, in the worst case, months later, by which time wild animals might have already discovered her remains. The teams covered mile after mile but found no trace of the missing woman. As the sun began to set, the pilot of a helicopter decided to fly over the isolated plain about 10 miles north of the city. While hovering over the marshlands near the dam, the pilot spotted the lifeless body of Tammy Renee. Tammy had been stabbed at least 35 times, suggesting that the killer had unleashed immense rage upon her. It was an extremely brutal murder, but there was no blood around the body, indicating that the attack had taken place elsewhere. Officers also found a blood-stained t-shirt and 2 gloves near the body, but there was nothing that provided clear clues about the killer's identity. Neither the autopsy nor another search of the family's home yielded any results. With no further leads, the investigators decided to interview Brian's wife. While this could have been an opportunity for a betrayed woman to seek revenge, she didn't take it. She confirmed that her husband was home on the night of February 7th. However, although the couple shared the same bedroom, the woman suffered from back pain and often spent the night downstairs in a recliner. This had been the case on the night of Tammy's murder, meaning Brian could have left the house in the middle of the night without his wife knowing. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the case. While Brian's wife corroborated his alibi to some extent, the possibility that he could have left undetected left the door open for suspicion. The discovery of Tammy's body only intensified the urgency of finding solid evidence, as both Brad and Brian remained plausible suspects in this horrific crime. The detectives now had to sift through the mounting clues to determine who had the opportunity and motive to carry out such a violent act. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. The detectives were grappling with a complex mystery, with several possible motivations and no conclusive evidence pointing to the true culprit. Then, the case took a completely unexpected turn. A letter arrived at the district attorney's office. It was written by one of Brian Clark's cousins. The man could no longer keep silent and wanted to unburden himself. According to the letter, Brian had confessed that on Tuesday, February 7th, he met Tammy at a motel, and they agreed to meet again later. Brian arrived at Tammy's house late at night. They grabbed 2 blankets and drove out of town in Tammy's truck. After spreading out the blankets, Tammy undressed, leaving only her t-shirt on, and asked Brian to use a condom, but he refused. Tammy's insistence enraged him. He attacked her, and they struggled for a while before Brian got what he wanted by force. However, during the assault, the condom remained inside Tammy's body. In a fit of rage, Brian grabbed a knife and stabbed Tammy. After killing her, he wrapped her body in the blankets and placed it in the truck, then returned home and parked the vehicle in the garage. Brian had to confide in his brother, who helped him dispose of the evidence. Many of the details listed in the letter were not known to the public. The anonymous author could only have known them through the killer. But there was a catch. The initial autopsy did not reveal any condom. To uncover the truth, another autopsy was conducted. Incredibly, upon re-examining the body, the pathologist discovered this crucial piece of evidence that had somehow been overlooked the first time. The discovery promised to provide the long-awaited lead that investigators needed. However, due to the time the condom had spent inside Tammy's body, the DNA sample could not be used for comparisons. What seemed like a promising piece of evidence now raised even more questions. Who wrote the letter? They clearly knew detailed information about the murder, but there was still no physical evidence directly proving that Brian was the killer. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Although the letter and the discovery of the condom suggested Brian's involvement, the lack of viable DNA evidence meant that the detectives needed to find other ways to corroborate the story. The fact that the letter contained information that only the killer could know was a strong indicator of its authenticity, but without concrete evidence linking Brian to the crime, the case remained frustratingly unresolved. The detectives were now tasked with tracking down the letter's author and finding additional evidence that could definitively tie Brian to the crime or lead them to a new suspect. Now the investigators began to piece together what Brad was trying to convey during his initial interrogation. Even before it was known whether Tammy had been murdered, he said, "All this evidence points to me, but I hope there's a body, because there will be something that exonerates me, maybe DNA, something like that." Brad could only have hoped for such evidence if he had planted it himself in an attempt to frame Brian. The question was, how had he obtained Brian's DNA? The investigators spoke with Brian and learned that he often disposed of used condoms by throwing them out the car window. It turned out that Brad had been following several of Brian's lovers. While tracking Brian, Brad discovered this habit, which allowed him to devise a cunning plan to incriminate his rival. Of course, Brad couldn't have known that the DNA wouldn't be suitable for analysis if it remained in another person's body for an extended period. The biggest problem remained that the investigators still didn't know where the murder had taken place. The police returned to the family's home for another search, hoping to find even the smallest clue. In Brad's closet, an officer found something intriguing, a small digital recorder. When the detectives pressed the play button, Tammy's voice filled the room. She asked to call Brian Clark. They talked for a few minutes, and then Tammy said, "I love you so much." From the beginning of the investigation, Brad had claimed that he didn't know who Tammy was seeing, but in the recording, Brian's name was clearly heard. Brad had set a trap to discover with whom his wife was meeting. He had placed the recorder in her car, along with a bouquet of flowers and a note. As Brad had hoped, Tammy assumed the flowers were from her lover and called Brian to thank him, inadvertently revealing his identity. This discovery painted a clearer picture of Brad's actions leading up to the crime. His knowledge of Tammy's affair and his desperate attempts to catch her in the act suggested that he was far more involved than he had initially let on. The recording was a critical piece of evidence, not only because it exposed Brad's knowledge of Brian, but also because it showed the lengths to which Brad was willing to go to gather information about his wife's affair. The investigators now had a stronger case against Brad. The discovery of the digital recorder suggested that he had been carefully plotting, and his efforts to plant DNA evidence to frame Brian pointed to a calculated and desperate attempt to escape suspicion. The detectives needed to continue digging to find the final pieces of the puzzle, but the focus of the investigation was now squarely on Brad as the likely perpetrator of this horrific crime. The police now wanted to uncover more about what else Brad might have lied about and how he managed to send an anonymous letter while in prison. Brad communicated regularly with his twin brother, Brett. When Brett was released from prison after visiting his brother, the police were already tracking him. Upon his arrest, they found a very interesting notebook in his possession, which listed all the facts that later appeared in the anonymous letter. Additionally, they found a letter from Brad describing excellent fishing spots. He had drawn a map indicating various locations near the dam. Given the murder charges against him, it was unlikely that he was genuinely concerned with something as trivial as fishing. The marked locations held significance for another reason. Following the instructions on the map, the officers discovered 3 large black trash bags containing blood-soaked bedding. The bags also held blood-stained rubber gloves, women's underwear, and a large tarp. The tarp explained why there was no trace of blood in the Renee family home. Here's how the events likely unfolded that night. Brad had prepared the tarp on Tammy's mattress and placed several sheets over it to ensure she wouldn't notice anything when she lay down in bed. On the night of February 7th, Brad entered the room and attacked Tammy, stabbing her multiple times through the sheets and slashing her throat. The bedding immediately absorbed all the blood. Brad then wrapped Tammy's body in the sheets and carried it, along with the bedding, to the garage, which was adjacent to their bedroom. He placed her body in the car, planted the evidence, and loaded both her body and the bags of bedding into the vehicle. As for Brad's story about the car breakdown on the road and his interaction with the patrol officer, it seems he was on the verge of being caught. He was likely on his way to Brian's house with the intention of planting evidence, confident that the condom would lead investigators to his rival. When he realized the condom hadn't been discovered during the autopsy, he had to come up with a new plan involving the fake confession letter, enlisting his brother's help to send it. This discovery brought everything into sharper focus. Brad had meticulously planned every detail, from setting the trap for Tammy to framing Brian. His communication with Brett while in prison allowed him to manipulate the situation from behind bars, and the map of fishing spots was a key that unlocked the final pieces of evidence. The blood-soaked items found in the trash bags provided the physical evidence that tied Brad directly to the murder scene, confirming that the crime had been carefully premeditated. The investigators now had a solid case against Brad. His elaborate scheme to frame Brian had failed, and the discovery of the tarp, blood-soaked bedding, and planted evidence made it clear that Brad was the true culprit. With the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, the detectives were able to bring justice for Tammy Renee and ensure that Brad faced the full consequences of his actions. The trial began in January 2007. Since the prosecutor was not seeking the death penalty for Brad, under South Dakota law, a guilty verdict would automatically result in a life sentence. The prosecutor expected the trial to be straightforward, but Brad made the unusual decision to testify in his own defense. No one could have anticipated what he would reveal when he took the stand. Unable to keep up the lie any longer, Brad felt compelled to confess everything. It wasn't he who killed Tammy, but his 13-year-old daughter, Hay. The problems began after Hay was informed that her parents were getting divorced. She was furious that her parents didn't want to reconcile and spent days in a deep state of sadness. On the night of February 7th, Brad came home late from work to find his wife and daughter already asleep. He also went to bed but was awakened by the cat around midnight. Brad heard some noise coming from Tammy's room and went to see what was happening. To his horror, he saw Hay standing over her mother's body, covered in blood and holding a knife. Blood was coming from Tammy's nose, indicating that she must have fought back. Brad screamed, asking Hay what she had done, but she remained motionless and didn't respond. Brad tried to help his wife, but quickly realized it was futile. His daughter was still standing there, showing no emotion. Only then did Brad realize that she was sleepwalking. Panicking, he took Hay back to her room and cleaned all the blood off her. He then attempted to clean up the crime scene. He put the clothes in the washer and carried his wife to the car. To protect his daughter, he decided to frame the man Tammy had been seeing. The next day, when Hay woke up, she acted completely normal, and Brad realized she had no memory of what had happened. Initially, he planned to escape to Mexico with his daughter, but he was arrested before he could do so. Brad explained that his daughter had always had behavioral problems and had even stabbed her stuffed animals when she was little. He admitted that he had broken the law and deserved punishment, but only because he was trying to protect his daughter. The prosecutor was pleased that Brad had testified because attempting to blame his daughter angered the jury members. In reality, the evidence indicated that the wounds on Tammy's body could not have been inflicted by a 12-year-old girl, even considering that she was a fairly strong volleyball player. During cross-examination, the defendant couldn't explain facts that had already been reliably established. Furthermore, Brad's twin brother had already confessed to everything. It took the jury 3 hours to reach a guilty verdict. However, Brad Rhea still insists on his story. He filed an unsuccessful appeal, claiming that he was framed by the investigators and that his daughter's DNA was never compared to the DNA found at the crime scene. The most terrifying aspect is that if a condom with Brian Clark's DNA had been found during the initial autopsy, this case could have ended very differently. The fact that the expected evidence wasn't found forced Brad to dig himself deeper, acting out of desperation. Hey Rhea lost both her parents the day her father decided to kill her mother. She moved to live with relatives in Wyoming and never saw Brad again. Fortunately, she didn't let the incident break her. The immense love that surrounded her mother became a source of motivation for the girl. Speaking on public platforms, she became the voice of domestic violence victims who can no longer defend themselves. Hay studied criminal law, got married, became a mother, and only regrets that her child will never know what a wonderful, kind, and loving person their grandmother was.